As she said, I am Katrina Debnam. I'm assistant professor at the University of Virginia. It's in Charlottesville, Virginia. And I have a joint appointment in School of Nursing and School of Education and Human Development. My training, is in public health. And so I have a master's in public health and health behavior and health education, which is really, I think, where my kind of passion still lies, is in health education and prevention. And so I really am passionate about the work and being able to serve my communities that way and providing health education and community health and behavioral health and being able to prevent some of the conditions and illnesses that people in my community suffer from, and teen dating violence in particular. So today I'm going to speak for a little while about Black adolescents and the future of teen dating violence prevention. And let's start here. So I was at a webinar a few weeks ago, and Victoria Bangert, who, if you've never heard her name before, she is what I would consider kind of like the founder, the kind of creator, or think of bystander kind of intervention, and thinking about how do we intervene for sexual assault and sexual violence prevention. And she said this one thing that, you know, just really stuck with me in the last month. And it's not, you know, it's probably not anything that you haven't heard before, but it keeps ringing in my head every time I think about the work that I do. And what she said was violence is complicated, and the solutions are complicated. And I keep coming back to that because I keep and thinking about the work that I do and the work that people and all of us in the field do, is that sometimes we get frustrated and disillusioned when things don't go necessarily according to plan, or things don't work out, or see automatic results from kind of the work that we do. And I just keep reminding myself that this is a complicated problem. The solutions are going to be complicated, and they're not going to happen overnight. And so that kind of has kind of helped me in thinking through this work. So I'm going to speak for just a few minutes about teen dating violence in general, give you some definitions and prevalence statistics from the US and from Canada. I'm going to talk a little bit about intersecting identities in teen dating violence. This is a particular area that I think is important to consider in the work that we do. And specifically, I'm going to talk a little bit about intersectionality as a theoretical frame in thinking about teen dating violence, as related specifically to Black adolescents in the U.S., which is kind of the population that I tend to want to work with and try to work with in preventing teen dating violence. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about challenges and risk from an ecological perspective, and some of the protective factors that they may have, and then just for a few minutes talk a little bit about the future of teen dating violence prevention from my own kind of perspective and thoughts about it, and would love to hear what you think. All right, so I'm starting with a quick definition of teen dating violence. And, you know, this definition is taken from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which is the national kind of organization in the US that thinks about health and disease prevention. And the definition is currently physical, sexual, psychological, or emotional aggression within a dating relationship, and that includes stalking. And so I'm going to break this down a little bit to think about the way that we kind of conceptualize teen dating violence. And I'm going to use this kind of acronym TDV, teen dating violence, throughout the presentation. I know that there are many other ways of kind of talking about this topic. Some people use adolescent dating aggression, some people use adolescent dating violence. And so there are a lot of ways to talk about it. I'm going to use TDV for consistency in my presentation today, knowing that there are slight nuances for each of those other terminologies. All right, so for teen dating violence, just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page, when we talk about that, here in the US, we are meaning these 4 specific subtypes. So physical dating violence is when a dating partner hurts or tries to hurt a partner by hitting, kicking, or using any kind of physical force, strangling, anything like that. Sexual is forcing or attempting to force a partner to take part in a sexual act or a sexual touching. This also includes sexting or a non-physical kind of sexual event when a partner does not or cannot consent. And I think that's the part that people, that we emphasize the most, that they either cannot or do not consent. Psychological or emotional violence or aggression is the use of verbal and nonverbal communication with the intent to harm another person mentally or emotionally and exert control over them. And then finally, stalking, this kind of pattern of repeated unwanted attention and contact by someone, a partner that may cause them fear or concern of themselves or fear or concern for someone close to them that they care about. What I think is, what I'd like to point out about these subtypes is that often we get questions about cyber dating abuse. And in the US, that we currently don't consider that a subtype, but we think about cyber abuse and in general about the use of technology to enact these different subtypes. And so using technology to enact kind of sexual violence through sexting, or using technology to enact psychological or emotional abuse through threats over the threats or demeaning or belittling your partner over text message or on social media. So it's the use of technology to kind of enact these different subtypes as opposed to a separate subtype. And I know not everyone agrees with that, but that's how we kind of define it right now in the US. And I think there's a good argument in both for both ways of thinking about it. So, in thinking about teen dating violence and violence as an issue, I think it's always, I always have to remind myself that that this issue, this public health issue in the US has come a long way in a very short period of time. Unlike many of the other diseases and illnesses that have been studied for decades upon decades in our countries, teen dating violence really emerged in the US in the 90s as an issue. It doesn't mean it didn't exist. We know it existed before then, but it emerged as a relevant issue to be studied and to be studied and to be kind of like worked on during that time. And so this graph, I didn't create this graph. This was created by Vandy Foshi, an article that she published in 2011 about the number of peer-reviewed kind of papers published on teen dating violence. So using that as a keyword, beginning in 1992. And so you'll see that, this only goes up to 2009, but as recently as 2003, which is less than 20 years ago, there were only 25 articles that really used that keyword. Now, if I was to check, in 2021, I'm sure that number has, is quadrupled and triple folded since then. But I think it's important to kind of keep reminding ourselves that we still, that we're relatively early in our understanding of some of the nuances about this particular, about violence, teen dating violence, and that we have come a long way and we still have a long way to go in thinking about how to best prevent and best treat. So just kind of perspective of how far we've come and how far we still need to go. So I was able to get some great data from Dinara from Canada that I'm going to kind of present to you. And you may have seen it before, but I think it's important to kind of talk about the prevalence of teen dating violence that currently exists. And so I think for this particular graph, we have YRBS, so the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is the annual survey that you fill out in the US each year, every other year, essentially. And for boys and for girls. And so there's different, it's from 1999 to 2009 and from 2013 to 2019. And these are separated in this graph, I think because the questions changed during that time. So even in our thinking about, it's what we're so early in thinking about this issue that even how we measure it has changed. And we're getting more refined and better in the way that we're measuring it. And then we have data from Canada on the right, the health behavior school children's, I think, school-age children survey. And so I think what's important to see is that, what's interesting to see is that girls, of course, are reporting higher rates right now, prevalence rates of dating violence in the two countries. And that for some reason, the rates in Canada are just slightly higher. And we can talk about why we think that's the case. It could be how we're measuring it, could be some other reasons, but just slightly higher there. And so this graph breaks down the prevalence of dating violence by type. So at the different bars represent the different subtypes, so physical, psychological, and cyber. We see there's a significant the girls significantly higher, are significantly more likely to experience psychological or emotional abuse. You see that the larger graph here at 32.7%. But what's also really interesting is that the youth who identify as non-binary have the highest rates compared to both boys and girls. And so this starts to get at what I want people to start thinking about these different identities that people present with, and how if we weren't measuring, if we weren't capturing people who identify as non-binary, we wouldn't be able to uncover some of the differences in the rates that exist for these different groups by type. And even with among the non-binary identifying folks, the psychological abuse is consistently higher across boys, girls, and them. When we talk about perpetration, we know that there is some relationship between victimization and perpetration, and that people that report that they've been victimized are also likely report that they have perpetrated dating violence in some way. But I think what's most important to just kind of continue to see in this graph is that the rates of psychological violence are higher, again, for girls, and that for non-binary identifying folks, their rates are extremely higher in perpetration, higher than both boys and girls identifying. And I know that there were some, I'm sure you guys have had presentations about LGBTQ identifying folks, but I think there is something to be thinking about when we're talking about gender, biological sex, and gender identity, and thinking about adolescent dating violence, victimization, and perpetration, that we haven't yet, I think, captured or been able to do a really great job of talking about and preventing. So I also wanted to talk about a little bit about race and ethnicity. In the US, the race is can be a very controversial and polarizing topic, but I think it's important to think about within the context of violence and victimization. When we talk about race, we're talking about physical differences that groups and cultures consider socially significant. And so, this is basically comes down to different skin color or phenotype, or even some traditional practices that they may have in common. But in the, particularly in the US, I think what's most challenging around doing prevention work and thinking about race is that these groups are so heterogeneous that, we have one group for one race category for American Indian and Alaska Native. And that it represents everything from people who are indigenous to this country to people in Alaska. And that there's a huge kind of different cultural differences between those two groups. But in our data, that they're all lumped together. And what could we uncover had they, if we were collecting that data a little bit differently? Same thing for Asian. We have everything from Far East to the Indian subcontinent represented there. Black and African American, which is the group that I tend to do a little work with. There's a lot of heterogeneity there. And then Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander. Everyone from Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, and other Pacific islands, which are completely different cultures if you do a little bit of study on them. And then ethnicity. Ethnicity is this kind of refers to the shared culture, such as language, ancestry, practices, and beliefs. And so we really only capture two types of ethnicity in the US, Hispanic or Latino. And so that's everything from Cuban to Central American to Spain or Spanish, and then not Hispanic or Latino. And so the kind of ways that people are grouped in our data can sometimes not provide the most probably the most accurate way of thinking about their prevalence rates. And so just trying to get at this idea of thinking about different intersecting identities. So this is some data from the YRBS, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey that they, as I mentioned, they do every year, every other year for youth in the US. And this is data on teen dating violence, prevalence, victimization by race. So what we see consistently over time, and this is just from 2013 and 2019, that folks, the youth who identify these are Black, Hispanic, or American Indian or Alaska Native consistently report higher rates of physical dating violence and sexual dating violence. I put these large red circles around Black adolescents because those are the ones that like I said, I tend to work a little bit more with. But I think what is most important about this data is that seeing that even over time, while the rates vary from year to year, that in general, there is a disproportionate or even a higher likelihood of experiencing sexual and physical dating violence among those groups. So I was able to get some more data, thinking about the teen dating violence victimization by race or ethnicity in Canada. And this graph really just shows kind of the increasing levels of victimization that we see if we look at it by race and ethnicity there. So the white and then non-white and then multiracial. And so the highest rate for victimization among multiracial for adolescents in Canada. Same thing for perpetration. So we still see this kind of stair-step effect of, the white, the non-white, the multiracial. And so again, like I said, there's always some relationship between victimization and perpetration, and that youth who report one usually report doing both. But it is interesting to see that if we break it down by these kind of categories, that you see the rate, the difference between white is 12% and multiracial is 20%, which is very, that's a significant amount higher for the group. And so when you're thinking about these kind of intersecting identities, I'm not just talking about, we only talked about so far race and kind of gender identity, but also thinking about, sexual orientation and age and religion and disability and ethnicity and geography, urban versus rural, that all of these different cultural factors can be associated with the rates of violence that you're seeing and how violence is kind of playing out, the factors that affected within those communities. And I think this is something that we all should be thinking about a little bit more in the work that we do, and how the youth that we're in our communities that we serve are representing many different identities when you see them. So if we look at this is a graph that looks at teen dating violence, victimization by race, and immigration status. And so again, we see that the increasing prevalence rates from white non-immigrants all the way up to white immigrants, and that there's this kind of escalating kind of victimization and there for each of those groups. This next graph is perpetration. So perpetration by race and immigration status. This one's a little bit different. So we're not seeing the same kind of stair-stepping prevalence, but we do see higher rates of perpetration among racialized immigrants and white immigrants. And I don't have necessarily theories why, maybe you do, but there are lots of factors that could be at play. When I'm thinking about intersecting identities for Black American students, I have to continually remind myself that not only am I talking about African Americans who are the descendants of enslaved folks in the US, but I'm also talking about Black immigrants, and that those represent a significant kind of portion of the population in the US, and that those groups include people from the Caribbean islands, from Africa, from Central America, from South America, who may have not had the same experience of enslavement that African Americans did in the US, but have different kind of have been colonized in a different way in the countries that they represent. And that those all represent different cultural kind of factors and influencers on how they see themselves and how they engage with the world and particularly with violence in the US. And so thinking about how we measure that and how I measure that in my work and the differences and how each of these groups thinks about the role of the gender roles and roles of men and women, and how to resolve conflicts in the household and in relationships can kind of be a little bit can be overwhelming because there's so many different cultures and identities represented. And so, and I'm thinking about how the data is represented for just Black American students, and thinking about these kind of different intersecting identities. You can see for this first row, this is kind of physical dating violence, and there's increasing kind of prevalence rate. So 6.8% for all Black males, 9.4 for all Black females. And then when we start to bring in different gender identities for Black adolescents, it goes up to 11.6. And then if we're talking about just same-sex partner sexual identity, it goes all the way up to 14.2%. And so if I was to collapse, when you're just looking at all Black males or just all Black females, you don't see these kind of higher rates that exist for these other groups. And so I think it's really important to continue to kind of think and question and query the information that you have in front of you to make sure that there aren't groups that may be overrepresented in your sample and you don't know, and wanting to address them more directly. So there's intersectionality is this term that is gaining a lot of popularity around the world. It was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and she used it to describe the intersecting kind of systems of oppression and discrimination experienced by Black women specifically. And I've heard it kind of used in many different ways, but there is a difference between kind of intersecting identities and this kind of idea of intersectionality. When we're talking about intersectionality, we're really talking about the systems of oppression and discrimination experienced by Black women. And so we're talking about the systems of racism, sexism, and classism. And that's not to say that these things are not experienced by other groups other than Black women, because they are. But I think it's important to talk about intersectionality without talking about the kind of structural systems of oppression discrimination is kind of an inaccurate way of using the term. Other ways you use, if you're not talking about those systems of oppression and discrimination, you're really talking about intersecting identities, which is fine too. But I think that this kind of frame or theoretical frame kind of guides how I think about the influences on Black adolescents, dating violence, kind of prevalence and rates. And that these kind of intersecting the systems of oppression, racism, classism, and sexism have shaped the way that many Black youth view themselves and how they engage in relationships with each other. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking about how the ecological kind of context of relationships for Black American adolescents. And so I'm using the kind of my own version of the social ecological model. And all that really means is that I'm looking at these different contextual factors. So starting from the societal kind of public policy laws and practices, to community, to organizational, which is in schools and workplaces, interpersonal influences, and then individual influences. And so I just want to kind of, as I'm talking about Black adolescents, I want you to also be thinking about the communities that you serve and how these different levels of influence may be affecting the kind of individual behaviors that you see in the relationships among your youth. Oops. All right. So when you're talking about kind of societal factors and public policy, I'm talking about it could be anything from laws and procedures that exist, but also in the US specifically, I'm talking for Black adolescents, I'm talking about structural racism. And so one of the ways this is related to violence is these kind of stereotypical representations of Black women. And these may exist for other groups as well, but like I said, I'm only talking about Black women right here, is that there's idea of kind of like these stereotypical representations of women, that they may be kind of hypersexual, what they would call Jezebels, kind of strong Black women, these terms that they use and that the youth can kind of take on as they're growing up. We see that youth as early as 13 and 14 start to kind of understand what role they're supposed to play in society and how society views them as a young woman, and that they begin to endorse some of those stereotypical representations because that's what's expected of them. Same thing for these kind of traditional gender norms. And I know that, you guys are doing a lot of work with gender transformative programs, but thinking about, when do gender norms get started very early in age, and how that then translates into how you engage in relationships can be challenging for youth to figure out. In the US, we don't have the greatest health and educational policies, I'll say. There's still school districts and states in the US that don't mandate comprehensive sex education, that they are still doing abstinence-only education in schools, and how that then translates into unhealthy practices in romantic relationships is, usually pretty glaringly obvious. And then substance use prevention and treatment. We know that substance use is it can be a risk factor and goes along with violence. We see that happen a lot, but we also don't have great programming for youth in substance use treatment. That a lot of the programs for substance use treatment start at age 18. And so we're really struggling, I think, in the US of being able to provide age appropriate services for youth who are struggling with substance abuse in their adolescent years. And then state violence. One of the areas that I'm starting to move into is thinking about how, over the last year, particularly, we've talked a lot in this country about the kind of criminalization and policing of Black men. And so if you are a young woman who's experiencing abuse by your partner, are you going to be more or less likely to call the police or reach out for help if you're also worried about your partner experiencing violence at the hands of police? And what does that look like for the kind of relationship, for you being able to disclose and get help from this kind of criminal justice system that's supposed to be there to support you? And so this is thinking about these kind of societal and public policy factors that may be having an influence on youth experiences of violence. When you start to think about communities, I'm talking about things like access to care. We do kind of have universal health care here in the US, and I know Canada's had that for many years, but thinking about the availability of these clinics, are there enough in the different districts, the neighborhoods that people live in? Are they providing culturally responsive care? Not just to, are they thinking about use different gender identity and sexual orientation and sexual identity and providing the care that they have? Are they making it harder for youth to disclose that they're experiencing aggression or violence by a same-sex partner? So are the clinics that we developed, that we have in these communities, able to provide the care that they need? Community violence, normalized violence in neighborhoods is something that we struggle with a lot. If you're used to seeing, aggression or violence in the street, then you may not be as surprised to see it when it happens in your own relationship or in your own home. We know that having access to weapons in the home makes it is a risk factor for someone being shot or being killed by their partner. But weapons are a constitutional right. And so how are we able to help you think about, how are we able to protect youth in their own relationships when the weapons are available in their home? And then, there's some challenge in thinking about out of school time. And so, there are not as many after school programs and summer programs available for adolescents. And that time is when we see a lot of risky behaviors happening. Risky sexual behaviors, substance use are happening in that out of school time. And so what are the ways that the communities are able to support their youth in a systematic and structural way in order to prevent some of those risky behaviors from happening, including violence? Schools. And so I'll say schools, seem to be doing probably are kind of the structure that probably are doing the greatest job of thinking about violence and preventing violence among youth. There are all these amazing kind of teen dating violence programs that exist. Safe Dates was one of the first. 4th R, Shifting Boundaries, Dating Matters is a relatively new one in the US. I mean, all these programs are really great and provide great educational services and thinking about individual kind of ways to prevent, individual and bystander kind of related ways to prevent dating violence. And the challenge with many of these is that, that they aren't always sustainable. Staff turnover in schools is hard to kind of manage. You have that 1 or 2 great teachers who are providing these lessons to students, and then they leave or they retire or they're no longer able to provide the program, and it kind of, it falls apart. And so one of the things I've been thinking about is how to link some of these programs to the changing perceived needs and priorities in schools. I mean, that we need to, one of the ways that, in talking to school districts and school administrators, which I often do, they always ask me, like, well, we need you to link those behavioral things to the academic outcomes. Is that we're charged with making sure that students succeed academically. And if you can't show me that providing these programs to students in the schools is going to actually increase their academic outcomes, I may deprioritize it in lieu of having another math club or another reading. And those are all important, but how are we able to kind of sustain our programs in a way? We also see that in schools, that the kind of having a safe school environment, having students feel connected to each other, helps them want to disclose when something negative is happening in their relationships. And so the ways that we can kind of increase school climate, which kind of increase the positive school climate and make students feel safe and connected to each other and to the staff in the school, they may be more likely to be able to disclose and seek help when something is going wrong. So family, friends, and social networks. This is probably one of the areas that there is a lot of work that's being done, a lot of work that has been done to kind of reduce the challenges and risk from family, friends, and social networks, and bystander intervention programs like Coaching Boys into Men and Bringing in the Bystander. These programs are all great programs for thinking about how to create a community around youth that will intervene when they see something negative, something is about to happen or is happening in their friends' relationships. One of the things that we are still, I think, trying or struggling a little bit with this kind of intergenerational abuse and trauma, and that if you are a youth in a home where you see the violence happening, or violence or even just aggression happening between your parents, you don't always internalize that as a negative, unhealthy relationship. And so you transmit, and so you kind of perpetrate those kind of those behaviors in your own relationship, not always knowing that those are kind of that those are unhealthy practices to engage in. And so how are we able to kind of like break that cycle that occurs in families from one generation to the other? Parent-child communication is something that there's been a lot of research thinking about, whether children are able to disclose kind of what's happening to their parent. A lot of times a youth will admit that they'll disclose to a friend and maybe to their parent if they feel comfortable. And so what are the ways that we can make sure that parents feel, have the self-efficacy, feel confident, and have a good relationship with their child so that they can go to them when there is a problem, that it's not just held within their friends and no adult knows what's happening. And then being able to provide programs to think about kind of thinking more inclusively and comprehensively about gender norms. What are the ways that we are asking females and males to kind of be in relationships in these kind of standard and traditional ways that may not be helpful for them when they're trying to resolve conflict or problem solve. These are all things that place them in greater risk or challenge in experiencing dating violence, and things that we should be thinking about in the context of a dating of individual kind of rates of dating violence experiences. And then what we think about, I think, traditionally is these kind of individual risk factors and individual behaviors. And I have here listed race, ethnicity, age, and income, because these are kind of these identities that I started the presentation talking about, right? But what I was hoping to kind of convey to you guys is that these in themselves are not necessarily individual risk factors for experiencing abuse, but those are indicators of larger ecological kind of factors that may be influencing whether these youth are experiencing abuse. So it's not that the youth is necessarily not because that they are non-binary. It's not because that they are not because that they're Black. It's not because they're maybe necessarily an immigrant, but it's these larger ecological factors that trickle down that make these individuals more likely to experience abuse. And so thinking about those factors a little bit thinking about those identities in more comprehensive ways, that the identity is who they are, but it is a larger kind of context that they're coming from that may be having influence on what's happening to them individually. So it could be things like substance use, it could be history of abuse, and it could be all these other structural racism, access to care, stress that they're experiencing that make them more likely to report experiencing dating violence. And so I don't like to think about those identities as risk factors, but as indicators of larger things and structural problems that we need to correct and fix. So, I'm getting close to the end. What I wanted to kind of end with is thinking about these kind of protective factors and resilience. I feel like we've done, there's a lot of work that thinks about some of these the ecological kind of challenges and risk factors for dating and violence, but I personally don't think as much work has been done in thinking about protective factors and resilience. And so what are the ways that we can build up the communities around the neighborhood cohesion, collective advocacy around youth to be able to look out for one another, for a neighbor to look out for, to see violence and be able to intervene or tell a child's parents is something negative or violent is happening. Our spirituality and religiosity component of protective factors. We know that not everyone who comes from who has experienced or seen abuse in their home winds up in a violent relationship. What are some of the factors that may prevent that from happening? Is it spirituality, religiosity? Is it racial identity and development? If you have a strong attachment to one of your identity groups, does that make you less likely or less likely to be a victim of abuse? Maybe, maybe not. We know that high quality friendships and social supports are really helpful in thinking about getting help for when you're experiencing violence among adults. And so why would it not be the same for youth? We know that one of the ways that abusers tend to work is that they exert power and control, and then they kind of alienate you, isolate you from your family and friends. And so if that's the case, by building up high quality friendships and social support around youth, will we be more successful in protecting them and preventing them from experiencing violence? So I'm going to end with just a few thoughts about the future of teen dating violence prevention. And these are probably not, necessarily themes that you guys haven't heard before, but I think a lot of them are worth repeating and kind of thinking about a little bit more. One is that we know that prevention is generally more cost effective than reaction. Is that, that it's hard and, experiencing violence is traumatic and has, lifelong effects. And so the better we're able to prevent those things from happening in the first case, the more effective we will be with youth. The earlier that they're implemented, the better the response. For a while, we were only doing kind of dating violence prevention in college age youth, and then we went down to adolescence. But we know that kids are starting to engage in what they call or what they think are in romantic relationships as early as 5th and 6th grade. And so how early should we be talking to them about what does a healthy relationship look like? I mean, age appropriately, of course, but how can we kind of make sure that they know this before they even start engaging in some of these behaviors and relationships that may be unhealthy? I talked a little bit about the promise and challenge of these kind of comprehensive violence programs. And so, right now in schools, we have all these different great programs that exist. So we may have like a social emotional learning program. We may have a teen dating violence program. We may have a bullying program. We may have a substance use or prevention program. And what we know is that a lot of the behaviors, the risk factors for some of these behaviors are shared. And so what are the ways that we can be more efficient and more effective in preventing all of those things and thinking about more comprehensive programs? And that may be, a little bit more sustainable in some of these schools as well. And then, of course, thinking about the kind of social ecology that we're targeting. So the more levels that we can target, the better. So if we can target both individual factors, interpersonal, so kind of families and support, the school, and then even the community, the more levels that we can target, the kind of bigger response that we'll get. And then finally, paying attention to the communities with elevated risk factors. And so, remembering that those risk factors are are not endemic to those individuals and their identities, but to the larger kind of structural and social ecology that they represent, and how they're being influenced by the, maybe that lack of access to care, to other larger policy and procedural things that may be affecting those communities, and how can we be more responsive to them in preventing dating violence. And I think I will end there. So thank you so much.
And thank you, Katrina. That was such a comprehensive overview of so much of the history of the field, and then sort of, I think, hopefully where we're going. So really appreciate you putting all of that together for us. So we do have a few minutes. So if you have a question, feel free to type it in the chat, or go ahead and unmute yourself, and we will spend a few minutes asking questions, and then we'll have a break.
And I'll stop my share. So
sure.
Well, I'll start it off. I really enjoyed the presentation. I thought it was excellent and a really good reminder about this, how important it is to focus on the larger social ecology of where we sort of interact, and this sort of relationship perspective. So as a community of practice that we have, like, we have 21 projects that are addressing some form of teen dating violence, based on your knowledge of the literature, then, if we're putting in universal programs, how do we address these issues of intersectionality in these universal programs? And what does the evidence tell us?
Well, I think there's not one way to do it. I think it's one, it's being aware that not everyone, that everyone is presenting while you're doing an universal program, that everyone that's receiving the program has different kind of contextual factors that are affecting their behavior. And so it's not always simply, and knowing that, I think being aware of that, I think is probably the first step, is knowing that, that it may not be as simple as just saying, don't do that, or talk to them this way, because there are different cultural and kind of different factors that may be influencing how they're doing it. And so being aware of that, I think it's important to, to kind of talk to youth and ask them, what are some of the factors that you think are contributing to this, and how would they go about working towards not having it, work towards doing something better or something more healthy in a relationship. But I think it is challenging with these, the universal programs are great, but I think that I think that sometimes maybe there's a more targeted group that needs to happen for people who may be a little bit more at risk.
Awesome, thank you. So I see some questions coming in. So I will go to Lee's question, which says they really appreciated the model you presented. Where can we read more about the ways you have modified the social ecological model that you use to unpack this violence? Any recent papers of yours that we could turn to that we can then make into a research summary?
That is a great question. I do not have a paper with that necessarily, that model. I know that I will say that the Center for Disease Control does have a violence prevention model that uses a social ecological model. And so they do kind of talk about some of the different, the different levels, and how interventions or programs can be targeted at each of those levels. It's not specific to youth necessarily, but that's a great idea. Maybe that's something I need to write. I need to maybe to write up, but I haven't yet. So I think.
All right. Well, we'll watch out for it.
Okay.
And then maybe we have one more question from Heather that I'll ask just before our break. So do the studies you've referenced differentiate between those who experience violence and do something about the violence, as opposed to those who aren't able to leave the abusive relationship? That seems like an important distinction.
That's a great question. I don't think we've gotten that far, honestly. Most of the measures that for teen dating violence ask about violence that's happening in the last 12 months. And so it's fairly recent, but we don't always ask whether or not they're still in the relationship. And so that's not always information we have to be able to make a distinction between the two. I think there are several there are several emerging kind of programs and interventions out there that are hoping to increase youth's kind of capacity to ask for help when they're in a kind of a violent or aggressive relationship. But I think that we haven't quite gotten there yet, that's not something that we're kind of screening for necessarily when we're collecting data, is who is still in the relationship and who isn't.
Mm-hmm. For sure. So much context is not there. And I didn't miss Claire's question. So Claire asked if the data that you presented showing the breakdown by race and immigration status has been published. And I'm gathering, she means the Canadian data. Some of it's about to come out. I just got the proofs this morning. And that particular data, no, but watch out. But if people are wondering or have questions, either Wendy or I are happy to talk about that data. And then if you have questions about the American data, Katrina's your person. So I'm just cognizant of the time, so I think we'll go to break. I did want to plug a new resource that PrevNet has as of this week, which is a whiteboard on dating violence and intersectionality. So that's the link, and it does show the social ecological model, just like Katrina. We didn't collab, I didn't see your slides before, but it talks about a lot of what Katrina talked about as well. So feel free to access that resource, and we will have more time in the breakouts to think about intersectionality and dating violence and what that means for your prevention programming. And Katrina, again, you're welcome to stay, but we know you're a very busy person, so if you have to go, that's fine. So just on behalf of the community of practice, I want to thank you so much again for sharing your wisdom and expertise with us. We're really lucky to have you this morning. And so thanks for being here, and everyone will take a break till, what time is it? 2 o'clock Eastern, noon Mountain Time. And then we'll resume with breakouts to talk more about what Katrina's just spoken with us about.
Thank you. It was great talking to you.